which is the highest rank given to foreign scholars teaching in China. Professor McLaren was named Outstanding Educator of America Award for 2013 by the Association of Educators of Latin America and the Caribbean. Let's welcome Professor Peter McLaren.
Well, I might have to sit down, if that's okay.
That's fine.
All right. I was just going to say, that was a marvelous talk, by the way. Thank you so much. That was really and I learned an awful lot, and I learned an awful lot from you, too. Thank you. It was marvelous. I would say, though, that the fascism in Latin America in general, we could trace back to the, for instance, the rat lines created by the OSS, later to become the CIA, Britain's M16, and the Vatican. For example, we know that Bishop Hugal, who was a Nazi sympathizer and rector of the Pontificio Instituto Teutonico Santa Maria in Rome, coordinated with German what they called German stay-behind operatives from the SS and the fascist Black Legions in order to help the Nazis and fascists to escape from countries liberated by the Allies, help them escape to Latin America, and to the US, and to mi país natal, my country of origin, Canada. And slowly, pro-fascist sentiments were normalized and weaponized in all US allied countries as part of a plan to resist a possible invasion of Western Europe by the Soviet Union, or to destabilize the possible ascendancy of communist parties in the West. So, in a sense, we can look back to the end of the Second World War. Basically, the choice of the United States had to make was, do we support fascists or communists? Because those seem to be the two prevailing sort of political, ideological forces. And of course, the US chose to support the fascists against the communists, of course. And of course, we can unpack that relationship in granular detail at some point, but I won't do that tonight. I want to share with you some remarks about fascism in the United States. And to do that, I'm going to share with you some notes, some ideas that I've crafted, and I think that, if you listen, I'll paint a picture with some words of what's going on. So I'm thinking of election night, 2016. The United States was shaken out of what we could call an electoral numbness as more Trump supporters than expected crawled out of the woodwork to vote, fomenting a backlash, or perhaps we could call it a white lash instead of a backlash, of extraordinary proportions. They came from former railroad towns where the Rust Belt meets Appalachia, from dirt-poor white neighborhoods adjacent to petrochemical processing refineries, where parents were tired of their children coughing up blood-flecked, blackened phlegm. To get to the polling stations, they passed through the ghost towns in rural Tennessee, where shuttered general stores and demolished dime dance halls held nothing but empty memories of earlier generations. They came from neighborhoods in Iowa where plants were no longer producing tower cranes and had laid off thousands of workers. Supporters of this orange Leviathan, this man we know as Donald Trump, included spindle-shanked retirees in eastern Kentucky living behind the 8-ball on straw mattresses in abandoned horse trailers, angry at the immigrants passing them by on the ladder. Even those laid-off coal plant workers, forced down railway tracks with their bindle sticks flung over their shoulders, fighting graybacks, i.e. fighting lice, and a disposable future with nothing left but a $10 bill hidden in the heel of their boot, wore Trump's trademark cap, "Make America Great Again." And as you may recall, Trump had blamed environmental regulation on the loss of coal mining jobs without ever mentioning the country's pivot to the exploitation of another fossil fuel, natural gas, that can even be a worse generator of greenhouse gas than coal. While hapless young vagrants and itinerant workers huddled in abandoned coal loading stations, shooting up Oxycontin, known in Appalachia as hillbilly heroin, with nothing left but to catch the westbound. That's a term they used during the Great Depression, meaning death. You know, they're going to catch the westbound train. It means you're going to go on your final journey, right, into oblivion, or the river Styx, or Valhalla, or what we call heaven, as the saying went during the Great Depression. Now, they were all behind Trump, even if they were too stoned to cast their ballots. With medically uninsured arthritic knees and aching kidneys, the laboring poor embedded in capital's extractive essence marched to the beat of nationalism, bemoaning the appearance of all those brown faces in the industrial yards and in the agricultural fields that spoke a language they couldn't understand. Migrant workers, largely from Mexico. They trekked through the dirt roads of Beaufort County, South Carolina. They trekked through Duplin County to the north, past acres of pasture-raised Berkshire pigs. They traveled to where they had last registered to vote, even if it meant a trip across the North Georgia mountains, through Clayton and Dillard, all the way to Chattanooga. Truckers for Trump drove their 18-wheelers through the low country of Louisiana, gator teeth swinging from the rearview windows so they could put the man in the red hat into office. For those who are experienced city life, you don't have to be on the rocks. You don't have to live on the nickel in penthouses made out of cardboard rather, strewn through the streets of Skid Row with cupped hands around the tin can, as John Hartford or Glenn Campbell might put it in one of their songs, in order to be a Trump supporter. Although generally risk-averse, many in the wage labor rich class, including socially registered suburban dwellers who loathed socialists and were often unforgiving of the errors of their employees, pushed for a Trump win, hoping that a further deregulation of the business world might bring them maybe some fast cash, at least enough to stoke their meager retirement savings before the system eventually fell apart like it did in 2008. And they had that in their minds. They had the crash, right? The housing bubble burst in 2008. They were thinking of that. They were thinking of how they suffered during that time. So some folks were just looking for a good luck charm, and the man with the Midas touch, Donald Trump, without anticipating that Trump's economic plan would raise taxes on 8 million low and middle class families while providing massive tax breaks for the rich. And it's no secret, especially in the hinterlands of the unemployed, that the internet and its burgeoning platforms of automation are poised to cut half of U.S. jobs in the very near future. 20 or 30 years, the jobs that are available now will not be available due to technological change. I wouldn't say necessarily technological advancement. So for many of those hooked on drugs, and this is a crisis in this country, it was too late to employ a Trump victory or to see what kind of health care program Trump would put in place of Obamacare. In Stark County, Ohio, people down on their luck shoot up meth mixed with carfentanil, an animal tranquilizer that is normally used on elephants and tigers. They shoot up with that. And it's 100 times more powerful than fentanyl, which apparently was the drug that Prince, the rock star, mistakenly took. He thought he was taking Vicodin, it was fentanyl. And this was 100 times more powerful than that. There are many overdose fatalities that the coroner's office in Canton has to, there's so many fatalities, so many, that the coroner's office in Canton has to borrow a 20-foot-long cold storage mass casualty trailer, known as a death trailer, normally used for victims of airplane disasters, since its morgue facility in the county jail complex on Atlantic Boulevard, which holds about a dozen bodies, cannot deal with the body count. So they have to bring in the death trailer regularly. So many people are dying of drug overdoses. Right? The coroners of Ashtabula and Summit County have to do the same thing. Call in the death trailers. In Montgomery County, to the south, the coroner calls local funeral home directors for help with all the bodies. So that gives you a little bit of a glimpse, at least, I tried to capture in my writing about the Appalachian poor white folks and perhaps what was going through their minds and their bodies when they decided to make that vote for Donald Trump in 2016. So it's quite clear now that we're facing not simply a prospect of a global police state, but the reality that a global police state has already come into being, even if we find at times to be somewhat out of focus. We find it out of focus quite a bit. But I can't remember in my lifetime when the organized working class was as weak as it is today. Far weaker than many other radical models that have been proposed. And I'm including the short time that I belonged to the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World. I was a wobbly for a short time. Now, it's not that fascism has been significantly absent over the past decades in the United States since World War II, but the pace with which 21st century fascism has come upon us is due to the fact that 21st capitalism has become a self-fueling engine whose capacity to travel the globe has intensified dramatically. That can be seen over the last few decades. You know, the shift from global capitalism to transnational capitalism. And I want to talk about that, and I want to emphasize that just for the next few moments. Those of us who've chosen a life of self-reflection in the midst of this age of time of historical uncertainty, the birth of new systems of surveillance, weaponized to crush the human will to resist, and a studied inattention to the perils of the marketing strategies designed to depoliticize us, we must continue to reflect upon the need to foreground, make visible the forces and relations of production as the medium of our most vital concerns if we're to break free from the shackles of alienation, lest we unsuspectingly betray what Paulo Freire said was our ontological vocation of becoming more fully human. Right? Our aptitude and inspiration for becoming social justice educators cannot be crushed, even during this world-altering time of ignorance. I can't even detect in today's factories of fear-mongering the most faint hint of optimism that is requisite for us to continue to live as moral beings, according to values that elevate and ennoble us, as Paulo Freire talked about, but rather those that now ethically impair us. Okay? So I have a personal investment in as many of us do here in the audience tonight, I've got a personal investment in this notion of fascism. And Professor Peter Lowndes, I would like to welcome you here. And he's in the audience tonight. Perhaps you remember in 2005, 2006, the Dirty 30, where a right-wing supporter of the Bush Bush Hijo, Bush Jr., with a lot of money, a lot of Republican money behind this individual or group of individuals, offered to pay students $100 to secretly audio tape my lectures at UCLA. $50 were offered to any student that could produce notes from my lectures. And I wasn't the only one. I was put on top of the list as the most dangerous professor at UCLA at the time. It became an international story. It was easy to find on the internet. Just go to Dirty 30. But 29 other professors were also identified as anti-American, as a danger to the minds of young people, because we were engaged in some form or another of critical pedagogy or popular education. At that time, I can remember several librarians at the UCLA library coming and telling me that, proudly, that they refused to cooperate with the FBI, who were in the library checking on what professors and students were taking out what books. You can imagine what the books would be, right? They'd be Marxists, right? Texts by Marx, or other revolutionary thinkers, or anarchists, or whomever. But the FBI was actually checking to see what books students and professors were checking out, and who was checking out the dangerous books. That was 2005, 2006. Right? That wasn't that long ago. Recently, I challenged Nigel Farage, who, the British politician, who is known as the architect of Brexit, right? The move to take England out of the European Union. And he came and I called him out as a fascist, which to the chagrin of course, the business school who invited him to come in. I think we need to call out the fascists. I think we need to, we can't simply, placate them. We can't try to humanize them. We have to call them out for what they are. So the promises of neoliberalism. So I think if we're going to look at fascism, we have to first look at neoliberalism. I'm going to just go through this very, very briefly. Christopher Hedges has written brilliantly on the topic of neoliberalism. So has people like Henry Giroux, and certainly Noam Chomsky, David Harvey, and others. Chris Hedges, in a recent talk, noted that concentrating wealth in the hands of a global oligarchic elite, 8 families now hold as much wealth as 50% of the world's population. Right? This global oligarchic elite is demolishing government controls, regulations, creating massive income inequality and monopoly power. This group is fueling political extremism and destroying democracy. So Hedges goes on to note that in the 1970s, as early as the 1970s, Keynesian economics was purged from the economics departments in universities. Keynesian economics, the welfare state, right? Keynes, the British economist, helped develop what was known as, in England, as the nanny state, right? Or the welfare state. There's at least some kind of safeguard if you lose your job. Some kind of safety net. Not enough, but something was there for the poor to rely on when they were in hard times. Well, Keynesian economics was actually purged from those departments in universities and institutions. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And suddenly, Keynesian economics disappeared in the media. People didn't go on the media defending Keynesian economics anymore. And there's a reason for that, obviously. There's a reason for that. Who controls the media? What conglomerates control the media complexes? Right? the ideas that prevailed in a capitalism that at that time was in trouble was market liberalization, was privatization, entrepreneurialism, possessive individualism, and this became known as the neoliberal agenda. It was blessed by the Chicago boys, like Milton Friedman, and controlled by institutions such as the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. Now, as I understand, before I came to Chapman University, a very courageous group of faculty, when Milton Friedman came to speak, I know Dr. Colon Muniz was part of that, and I think Jerry McNenny, you were part of that, when the faculty stood up and turned their backs on Friedman when he was giving his address. And other members of the Paulo Freire Democratic Project were there as well, resisting what Milton Friedman had to say. I think he was getting an honorary doctorate at Chapman, and he was, I believe, the thesis director of our then president, President Doty. So anyway, this was basically what we could call well-orchestrated class warfare. And slowly but surely the working class were singled out. They were demonized during the Reagan administration as welfare cheaters. And as a matter of fact, Reagan created this story, this composite that he claims is a real person, an African-American woman who was driving a Cadillac and was living, in a apartment with color TV and stereo equipment, etc. And she was basically, living the life of Riley, as we used to say, on government checks, cheating the government. And so Reagan was able to create and foment this kind of visceral hatred of welfare cheaters. I'm not, the saying that you would hear from the lips of many working class and middle class Americans were, I'm not going to pay for them to sit at home and do nothing. So now, I want you to listen to this term. It's called the transnational capitalist class, and it's a term used by a friend of mine and a brilliant sociologist named Bill Robinson, or William I. Robinson. His works are amazing. He started out as a journalist in Nicaragua and then became a sociologist, and he's developed what some might consider a controversial theory on the development of capitalism over the last, well, actually since the Second World War. I think he's right on the mark, and other people like Jerry Harris and Leslie Sklar, other sociologists, use this term transnational capitalist class. The transnational capitalist class refers to the segment of the bourgeoisie that controls supranational instruments of the global economy, such as transnational corporations. It's multi-pronged. It has two main features. Corporations are one, and the other is the state. It's essentially a global ruling class. Now, this transnational capitalist class collaborates across national borders to achieve their objectives of increasing value production, right? Augmenting value. Value in this sense, I'm using the term value as monetized wealth, okay? The state often serves the corporations through organizations such as Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, rather than being served by the corporations. Now, this is not to say that corporations don't benefit states, and it's certainly true that the state helps to serve corporate interests through offering tax breaks and other incentives, etc. Some people say Robinson is eliminating the role of the state. He isn't. He's accounting for the changes that have occurred in the relationship between corporations and states. Right? During the shift during and after the shift from global capitalism to transnational capitalism. Now, you might say, well, don't, you know, all this talk about nationalism, Bolsonaro, right? Trump. You know, the me first, the, you know, Germany, you know, über alles, right? Right? But then listen to this. Robinson points out that the first transnational oil company to be assisted by the U.S. State Department in the wake of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq was the French oil company Total, followed by Chinese oil companies who were able to enter the Iraqi oil market thanks to the U.S. occupation. We're not talking about national capital, we're talking about transnational capital. You know, people's allegiances are to the money, not necessarily to the country, right? Think about Trump's recent, you know, the revelations that have come recently about Trump and building a Trump Tower, for instance, in Moscow during his transition. Now, we're witnessing the rise of a truly transnational capital and a transnational capitalist class which operates as part of a dialectical struggle with global labor. It's all about global accumulation and production rather than national accumulation and production. This new global ruling class controls a global power block that consists of allied groups and strata that together form alliances and long-term strategies. So it's really, you have to understand fascism today. I think it's important to understand the attempt to create a global hegemonic bloc where the transnational capitalist class is able to manipulate the consent of all those who attempt to join the bloc, while at the same time keeping those outside of the bloc contained or excluded entirely. So included in this group are the supranational agencies such as the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the dominant political parties, media conglomerates, technocratic elites, state managers in both the North and the South, as well as public intellectuals on the right, who provide the ideological legitimacy and technical solutions. Right? So we need to examine, I guess this is the takeaway from this, we need to examine how the modern nation-state has fused with national markets and rising capitalist groups to form the modern nation-states that today define the international system. The key to constructing fascist social relations and structures to support them is to have at your service what I would call a group of demagogues. I call them channel masters. They're media-savvy, right-wing pundits who specialize in othering. That is, they specialize in channeling the rage and the frustration of the exploited and the immiserated away from the elites and towards racialized and sexualized others who could be immigrants, people of color, members of transgender groups, etc. I'm thinking of people like we all know, Sean Hannity, the Rush Limbaugh, Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones. They would all definitely fit this description. These demagogues disguise themselves as friends of the working class, yet they serve as predators whose own fortunes rely on moving wealth from labor to capital. And they accomplish this by supporting the most obscene reductions of taxes for America's most succulently rich. Government revenue for keeping America's infrastructure from collapsing will, as usual, come from the working classes, redistributing wealth upwards from the working classes to the elite few. Now, when you take the brakes off the financial system, you end up with what we call financialization. This is a central factor of fascism. The creation of financialization, where you end up with inflation, mergers, acquisitions, credit and stock manipulation, and other truly nefarious schemes. And Chris Hedges puts it bluntly when he says, neoliberalism, wielding tremendous financial power is able to manufacture economic crises, to depress the value of assets, and then seize them. It depresses the value of assets, and then it seizes them and takes them like predators in a jungle. Now, Hedges quotes David Harvey, who gives an example. Hedges says, the foreclosures of the housing left lots of housing out there, which could be picked up very cheaply. Blackstone comes in, and this, of course, is during the housing crisis. Blackstone comes in, buys up all the housing, and is now the biggest landlord in all of the United States. It has 200,000 properties or something like that. It's waiting for the market to turn. When the market turns, which it did do briefly, then you can sell off or rent out and make a killing out of it. Blackstone has made a killing off of the foreclosure crisis where everyone lost. It was a massive transfer of wealth. And that's Chris Hedges quoting David Harvey in a talk Harvey gave fairly recently. Now, we've all heard about the term freedom. You know, we have freedom to do things, but we have freedom from things we don't want to interfere with our lives. We have freedom to pursue our own interests. We have freedom from being persecuted, from pursuing our own interests, for example, right? Everyone, of course, is free to sleep under a bridge or a highway overpass. But you don't see many rich people inclined to make that choice. Right? We can all sleep under a bridge. We can all sleep on the sidewalk out here. We're free to do that. You don't see many rich people inclined to make that choice. So for Hedges, the tributaries of neo-fascism percolate out of the cesspools of neoliberalism, abolishing civil liberties under the cover of the national security state, activating the mimetic scapegoat mechanism by branding critics, including the media, the enemies of the state. So, now, I guess one other takeaway, and then I'll move on. One key difference, this is Bill Robinson's idea here, one key difference between 20th century fascism and 21st century fascism is that the former involved the fusion of national capital with reactionary and repressive political power, whereas today's fascism involves the fusion of transnational capitalism with reactionary political power. It's crucial to stress that Trumpism does not represent a break with capitalist globalization, but is rather a recomposition of political forces as the crisis deepens. So if we want to understand the political phenomena that's occurring today, we must not confuse surface appearance with underlying essence or structure. And that's right out of Bill Robinson's book. So an intensification of neoliberalism in the United States that assigns a major role to the state in subsidizing transnational capital accumulation in the face of stagnation and overaccumulation is bound to open the floodgates of authoritarian populism that could well instantiate fascism within the very structures of the American state. We talk about the building of private prisons, the building of immigrant detention centers, border walls, homeland security technologies, etc. So the transnational capitalist class is creating the conditions of possibility for a global war economy, right? To defend itself against rebellions from below. You talked about some of the possible rebellions and resistances. The transnational capitalist class is preparing itself for those attacks through the surveillance state, largely speaking. Now we take a look at Latin America. I'm almost finished. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of these papers. But take the case of Latin America, for instance, and we had a brilliant discursus, exegesis from our wonderful guest today about what's happening in Brazil. Now, here's a quotation from James Petrus, who is, in my mind, a very keen observer of what's happening in America Latina. President Trump has built and extended U.S. imperial victories throughout most of Latin America. Satellite regimes are in place in Brazil, thanks largely to the judicial legislative coup which overthrew President-elect Dilma Rousseff, right? So he was writing this before, right? Bolsonaro became president of Brazil. The puppet regime of Michel Temer that has privatized the economy, embraced Trump's dominance, and aligned with efforts to overthrow Venezuela's government. Similarly, Trump inherited from Obama the present-client regimes in Argentina. President Mauricio Macri, I was there, campaigning as hard as I could, whenever I could give talks there in Argentina, just prior to the elections there. We've got Martín Vizcarra. In Peru, we have President Hernandez. In Honduras, we have President Cartes. In Paraguay, we have Chile. We've got President Piñera. In Ecuador, we've got President Moreno. And most of the ruling elites in Central America and the Caribbean, right? These are basically satellite regimes, we could say to a certain extent, of the transnational capitalist class. Trump has added to this list current efforts to overthrow the Ortega regime in Nicaragua. And under President Trump, Washington has succeeded in reversing relationships with Cuba and the so-called peace accord in Colombia between the guerrillas and the Juan Manuel Santos regime. In July 2018, Trump succeeded in backing the accession to power of Duque, a protege of the far-right party of Uribe in Colombia. President Obama's reversal of center-left regimes via coup have been consolidated and expanded by Trump, with the important exception of Mexico. Right? That's interesting. With Obrador, right, who was inaugurated today, and I think this is a precipitous moment now. And I know that Evo Morales, and I know also that President Maduro were there, and I would say to Miguel, Miguel, by the way, thank you for organizing this with Anaida, right, and Mac. I want to thank you so much for making tonight possible. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened? They were, the PRI, as they were leaving, called Maduro and called Evo dictators. Is that correct?
Yes. So the PRI, the prettiest outgoing party that's been pretty much in power for over 70 plus years. And I guess the way I read it, it was a kind of political stunt and opportunism during the inauguration of AMLO, to protest these two leaders. But the greatest irony, and I mentioned this earlier to somebody, is if there is any dictadura or dictador, it's the pretty government itself.
Right.
That's been in power for so long.
Exactly. Well, I'm going to wrap up here. I just want to conclude by talking about the work of a friend of mine who's done incredible work on fascism, Carl Boggs. I went to a wedding. Actually, Carl got married recently, and it was an incredible ceremony. It was hosted by FDR's grandson, great-grandson, no, great-grandson? I guess great-grandson. And we were all given a white rose to hold, and a symbol of the White Rose movement in Nazi Germany. And I'm going to end on that note in just a moment. But I just wanted to share with you some of Carl Boggs's very incisive understanding of fascism in the United States. Of course, if you want to look at fascism, and if you want to look at the origins of fascism, read the Frankfurt School. Right? Read Adorno's book on the authoritarian personality. Adorno did that with a couple of other researchers here in California. And the authoritarian personality is still very relevant today. And read Marcuse. Now, it's very interesting, and this is really hit me very hard emotionally. The Frankfurt School in a way, at least in North America, has been foundational in critical pedagogy, right? Like Freire's work has. So we take Freire and we bring in Adorno, we bring in Marcuse, we bring in, you know, Walter Benjamin, we bring in Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and many other thinkers. Habermas, well, I'm not that great fan, but important thinkers, right? And we use Paulo's work and the Frankfurt School to sort of scaffold some of the central concepts in critical pedagogy. Well, the right wing have written about the Frankfurt School. They actually know who the Frankfurt School theorists are. And many of them, I've got their names here in my paper, I can share with you later. But just to summarize, the Frankfurt School is blamed by these right-wing thinkers, by these sort of, I would call them pseudo-intellectuals. They're blamed for things that the right have come to hate about the United States. They blame the Frankfurt School thinkers on political correctness, feminism, LGBTQ rights, transgender communities, etc. They say it's the cultural Marxists in the universities that have created this political correctness, that have created, you know, the grounds for feminism, etc., and they're blaming it all on the Frankfurt School. They're saying we really didn't win the Second World War because it was a group of Jewish intellectuals, because the Frankfurt School were all Jewish. It was a group of Jewish intellectuals who fled the Nazis, went to the United States. As we know, Marcuse ended up staying. He was a professor. He was Angela Davis's professor. And they're kind of stealth intellectuals. They've invaded the campuses of our country. And that's why we've got political correctness, and that's why we've got feminism, that's why we've got multiculturalism. And that's why we've got people supporting immigrants with darker skin than we have. You see? And they've written about, so when the right hears the word social justice, they immediately think, aha, social justice, yes, cultural Marxism, yes, political correctness, yes, the attack on white men, yes, the attack on patriarchy, yes, the attack on, you know, being heteronormative, etc. So when I've had some people on the right tell me, when we hear the word social justice, we want to vomit. We want to run as fast as we can, because we know what social justice means. It means political correctness. So it's very interesting. Now, if in fact the Frankfurt School and the work of Paulo, etc., and of course other intellectuals and traditions, Marxist humanist tradition, of course, all these traditions are part of critical pedagogy, or what I call revolutionary critical pedagogy. Because in some senses, critical pedagogy can be domesticated. You know, Paulo would always say, reinvent me in historical specificity and the geographical specificity of the moment, right, of where my work takes root. Don't just transplant me like an organ. I'm Brazilian, I think like a Brazilian. I act like a Brazilian. I make love like a Brazilian. You know, I feel tesão, right? You know, you can't just transplant me, you know, because that country will reject the transplant. Reinvent me in the context of where I am. And so I've tried to reinvent Paulo, and I've also tried to bring in, you know, bring Paulo and Che Guevara's work together, etc., etc., etc. Now, if critical pedagogy is grounded by the so-called cultural Marxism, you can imagine what the universities are going to, you can imagine what's going to happen in the universities under Trump, especially if Trump gets another 4 years. He's very likely going to purge the universities of critical pedagogy, of people that support Paulo Freire. Right? That's very likely to happen. That's very, very likely to happen. So, to end, Okay. This is really fascinating, what Karl Barth said. This is really fascinating. Karl Barth warns that the truncated liberalism of a militarized state capitalism might sooner or later be compatible with a reconstituted fascism. In other words, this form of fascism could function quite well within a pluralist state and relatively open public sphere. So what he's basically saying is, if fascism comes to the United States, it's going to come under the name of democracy. It's going to come under the name of democracy. This is going to be what Bach says is an integrated oligarchy. It's going to be far more organizationally and technologically sophisticated than anything generated by earlier fascism, suggesting a lessened reliance on coercion and terror. This form of fascism will rely less on coercion and terror. In other words, fascism will be consolidated, and it could easily work without a single-party state. It could work without a tyrannical leader, and it can actually work well without paramilitary death squads, the likes of which we saw in the 1970s and 1980s in Latin America. So basically he's saying that the forms, right, the social forms, the institutional formations of a pluralist, liberal democracy like the United States could become very compatible with fascism. We don't need the National Guard out on top of the buildings. We don't need, trucks driving by us with people with military people in mascaras, right? We don't need that. Here, fascism, it's going to be a kind of it's going to be so ideologically sophisticated that those forces won't be necessary. People are just going to hate and continue to hate. And that hate is going to continue to be fomented. Okay, and so if you want to look on fascism, by the way, I'm just going to point this out. There was a fascism scale that Adorno created right after the Second World War. And if you strongly believe in these following statements, you might not be a fascist now, but you could be the kind of person who would probably fall for a fascist demagogue, like Bolsonaro, right? Or like Trump. One, there's too much emphasis in college on intellectual and theoretical topics, not enough emphasis on practical matters, and on the homely virtues of living. Two, homosexuality is a particularly rotten form of delinquency and ought to be severely punished. If you agree with these, you're likely to be a fascist. Human nature being what it is, there will always be war and conflict. There are some things too intimate or personal to talk about even with one's closest friends. There are some activities so flagrantly un-American that when responsible officials won't take the proper steps, the wide-awake citizen should take the law into his own hands. No insult to our honor should ever go unpunished. Every person should have a deep faith in some supernatural force higher than himself, to which he gives total allegiance and whose decisions he does not question. Too many people today are living in an unnatural, soft way. We should return to the fundamentals, to a more red-blooded, active way of life. So, for instance, that was part of Adorno's fascist scale. That's what he created right after the Second World War. But doesn't it sound familiar? It was exactly, it was almost parallel to your side show. It was, wasn't it? And this is Adorno and Adorno's co-authors and co-investigators writing right after the Second World War. I think the book came out originally, I think, in 1950, but I could be wrong. So, I mentioned that I attended a wedding of my friend Karl Barth's, and during the ceremonies it was presided over by Ford Roosevelt, the grandson of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and we were all gifted with the White Rose in memory of the White Rose Group, a teenage German resistors to the Nazi regime, and sentenced to the guillotine by Judge Freisler, who was the blood tribunal judge. I've written about Freisler. He appears in my writings, in the last year or two. Freisler comes in, and I think of Sophie Scholl. I think of her brother Hans Scholl. I think of Christopher Probst. all in their early 20s. Freisler excoriated them mercilessly for several hours before convicting them of treason and sentencing them to death. Hours later, they bravely faced the guillotine. And before his head fell, Hans cried out, "Long live freedom." Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Questions? Preguntas?
So what are we gonna do? We're in trouble,
Yeah,
right?
we're in trouble.
What are we gonna do?
You know,
We're in big trouble, you know, because it is an international phenomenon. That's what's going on right now, right? It's being spread. There's resistance, but there's also this tendency now to elect really conservative people and to, well, we already know that there's this small group of people that have been already, you know, influencing not only the capital, but the wars that go on, right? So.
Right. But the other thing is that they capture that transnational group captures the rhetoric of the situation by
Yes.
invoking freedom,
right.
and freedom
They use our language.
will be the rallying call for all kinds of transnational moves.
Well, you know, you find that in Reagan co-opted the term the Reagan Revolution. Before, the name revolution was, the term revolution or revolution was a term that any, you know, concerned conservative would be very adept at not using. I mean, that term revolution was always had a connotation of, you know, barricades, the Paris Commune, right, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And so Reagan actually took that term and made it the Reagan Revolution. So he co-opted that term. And I think what Jerry was saying is that the term freedom could indeed be co-opted in a similar way. It's absolutely scary. I mean, if you walk, for instance, through the pathways of Chapman University, you will find busts or statues, I guess you could call them busts, right, from the waist up. For $3 million, you can name somebody and have them considered.
Peter McLaren.
Well, you've got Ronald Reagan, you've got George Shultz, you've got Margaret Thatcher, you've got Milton Friedman, and of course you have Paulo Freire, and of course you have Martin Luther King, you have Benito Juarez, the only indigenous president of Mexico in the history of Mexico, which is primarily an indigenous country. There's been one. And so that's really interesting. And it was Benito who actually had a correspondence with Abraham Lincoln. It's very interesting. But we also have Ayn Rand. Now, Ayn Rand, some polls have reported that the works of Ayn Rand, not Anne Rand, it's A-Y-N, Rand, her works have, there's only been one book that's outsold Ayn Rand, The Fountainhead, or was it Atlas Shrugged, I'm not sure, and that's the Bible. Ayn Rand, there's a bust to Ayn Rand. She wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. She has bargained the torso with the young girl's banker father. And there was a lot of descriptions of this killer. And, you know, in the newspapers were abuzz with his confessions of what was going through his mind when he was severing through the limbs. And Ayn Rand's notebooks show that she admired him so much. And that was the kind of man that she aspires everyone to be. That, you know, he went against all conventions and absolutely fulfilled his wish.
His will.
his will. He fulfilled, thank you, Angie, he fulfilled his will. So she is modeling her, she has the Übermensch, she's got the kind of the lowly, less than human person would be anyone who doesn't act like this guy. And this is a kind of a pathetic version of Nietzsche, right? And so you've got this bust of Ayn Rand who's there. And there's an Ayn Rand association in many universities around the country.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. I just wanted to chime in. What you just said reminded me of winning. Trump's all about winning, right?
Yeah.
And I guess when he was mimicking, I forget the professor from Stanford that was in the Kavanaugh hearings.
Yes.
Like he was recently interviewed, and he was asked, well, when he was finally, confronted about it, he said, "Well, we won. That's all that matters."
That's right.
So, but I wanted to talk about what Dr. Colón Muniz was questioning about what to do. And right about that time during the Reagan Revolution, another term that was co-opted was grassroots.
Yes.
And I remember that was at a time when I was getting this political awareness, and I thought grassroots, organization was about, and when now the right uses it, now it's their term almost, and I'm like, when they co-opted it, man, I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. What to do? I think going back to the Frankfurt School, I think I've been a student of Professor McLaren's for 4 semesters. It's been quite a privilege, and so I did study a little bit of Horkheimer. And one of the things that he was really pointed out was that it was the lack of engagement with the ruling class that allowed Nazism to happen. So in other words, it's the questioning and the constant interrogation. So asking questions is very powerful.
And asking dangerous questions. Look what happened to Paulo. 70 days in prison, right? Because the ruling junta felt that peasants, under the tutelage of Paulo Freire, were asking questions that shouldn't be asked, right? Dangerous questions. Like, maybe I always thought that I'm poor because I was just unlucky. Or maybe I'm poor because I'm not intelligent as the rich. Or maybe I'm just unlucky. Maybe God wanted me to be poor. And then people started asking questions about what is it about the way capital and social relations and social structures, why is it that our communities in the favelas end up reproducing themselves? Generations and generations of poor people. Do you think God wanted generations and generations of poor people to just simply sit and take it without asking the question, why? In a critical way. And of course, when generations of students start asking those kinds of questions, then that's when the ruling class becomes nervous. And they want the universities to function in a very different way. I think that it was 2 million federal workers were sent a memo last week, federal workers in the U.S., that they could not use the word resist or impeachment while they were at work. They were forbidden to use the word resist or impeachment. 2 million workers were sent a notice from the White House that this will not be tolerated. And so then it'll be, you can't talk about that in the classroom, and then it'll be, you can't congregate in groups on the street corner, and because you could be talking about resisting or impeachment. I mean, things like that exponentially expand. And so, yeah, and I quite agree with you, Dora. I think it's, one of the things that, I mean, basically Clinton gave ammunition to Trump when she used the word the deplorables. She used the word deplorables to describe Trump supporters. And of course, that was sort of shaming, you know, the poor, and it was just giving a weapon to Trump. And of course, after that, you got the white working class to where, you know, they were wearing T-shirts, proud to be a deplorable. And it's, and you know, and it's, and the racialization is incredible because white folks, when interviewed, and there have been some studies, we went to see a speaker in La Verne University recently, Nolan Cabrera, who talked about his book, White Guys on Campus, in how after interviewing a lot of young white men, they believe that they're the most oppressed people in the country. White men. And this isn't surprising.
Well, that's another co-opted gender rights. It's now a white man, you know, machista deserves gender rights because he's being oppressed.
That's right.
By the
That's right.
Me Too movement.
Yeah, part of the Me Too movement. Yeah. So you get this an awful lot, but it's really interesting because I remember back when I was a professor at Miami University of Ohio, my daughter at the time was graduating from high school. And that year she went to the Halloween dance at the school. This was in Ohio, rural Ohio. And at the Halloween dance, some of the students wore their parents' or their grandparents' Ku Klux Klan robes. And apparently used the N-word, and there were African-American students at the Halloween dance. Something like that. I may have the details a bit, you know, they might not be absolutely accurate, but that's the general idea. And I went to talk to these young white high school students, and they said, this was back in 1980, this was back in 1985. And they said the same thing, basically. They said, well, you know what? We can't wear our Confederate flag T-shirts. We can't show our pride being white students, white guys. But the black students, they can wear, you know, Malcolm X hats, or they can wear Martin Luther King, you know, buttons or whatever. And we're not allowed to wear the Confederate flag, the symbol of white pride. Well, of course, it's a symbol of, you know, of torturing and hanging and lynching black people. I mean, if they got a sense of what the Civil War was all about. But even at that time, there was a sense like, how come we white guys can't show our solidarity as white guys? And they already they were acting as if somehow they were oppressed. And students that come to universities, very many white male students, will come in and they'll take a course, and the professor maybe for an hour will talk about racism and white privilege, or, you know, white inoculation, as Nolan Cabrera would say. Whites are sort of inoculated at birth vis-a-vis their own privilege. Well, you know, I mean, I'll tell you, for a white person having to sit through 1 hour a day, or 2 days a week, or 3 days a week for 1 hour, having to discuss white privilege, it makes them uncomfortable. Somehow that's equivalent to the racism, the structural racism, and the lives of people of color in this country who are shot. If they're black, they're shot, they're killed. If they're Latino, if they're demonized, they're screamed at, they're put on the school-to-prison pipeline, and they live daily with fear and fear of all kinds of violence from white people, and they live with that every day. And the white students have to sit through 3 classes at the university where maybe the professor brings up an uncomfortable topic about white privilege. Now, come on. And that means you're the most oppressed in the United States society? That's absurd. Yet, there's when Trump comes along, it's like, damn this, this political correctness, I'm white, and, we founded this country, and blah, blah, blah. And they love it. They suck it in. Believe me, I'm white. I was inoculated into my white privilege in Canada 70 years ago. And I've been unlearning it ever since, or trying to unlearn it. And I think I've unlearned most of it. But, it's a daily fight. I can't say I'm not racist because, I probably, there are kernels in there somewhere that I haven't been able to deal with yet. But, I'm formally anti-racist. I'm anti-fascist. I'm anti-sexist. I'm anti-homophobic. I'm pro-gender equality. I'm pro-working class solidarity. I'm pro-socialist struggle and unity for a society outside of the value form of capitalism. When I was in Argentina, the IMPA factory invited me because they've created some schools based on Paulo's work, my work, and other people's work. Schools where factory workers and their children can attend the same factory, like school, right? Like, so there's parents and the kids.
Yeah, school within a factory.
There's school within a factory, exactly. Angie was there with me. My wife Angie. And great solidarity there. So we went to this factory, and they said, we've achieved socialism. And I could see what they mean. They kicked out the capitalists. But they still operate within a capitalist system, within the marketplace, right? And so they got rid of the capitalists, but they haven't gotten rid of capitalism. And of course, one factory in one country, or even 200 factories that have been recuperated in Argentina is not enough. Now, when Hugo Chavez was around, he was starting to create a hegemonic bloc in America Latina that possibly, if Chavez had been alive today, could have been created. Possibly. I don't know. And to challenge the United States. You talked about BRICS, right? So we don't know. But anyway, I've kept you guys here for a long time. Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you.
So thank you, Peter. Let's also thank Janaina again. Thank you so much.